Thank you.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, by definition, a Statutes Amendment Bill deals with issues that are uncontroversial, non-contentious, they're generally minor and technical, and those facts justify the use of an omnibus bill. The bills generally go through without major debate. But I've read through the Statutes Amendment Bill, and it seems to me that while the measures it contains are by and large innocuous, they also are, interestingly, a catalogue of government botch-ups since the last election. And I want to give the House some examples of that by going through the bill part by part. It might need an extension of time, as Mr Twyford has explained. Part 1 deals with the Accident Compensation Act, and the clause that it deals with gives the Minister for the Accident Compensation Corporation power to direct the ACC to give effect to government policy. But I've got to say, Mr Speaker, this has caused enormous problems over the last couple of years. I mean, we had the absolute debacle of Nick Smith creating an artificial crisis in claiming that the ACC was insolvent and going down the gurgler. And that was, as a respected commentator, Brian Fallow, described at the time, a whole lot of shrill scaremongering and gratuitous scapegoating. So, are we really confident that we want to give the Minister this power to direct policy to the ACC? Nick Smith's policy was about privatisation. It was about cutting back protection for people. I remember most particularly, Mr Speaker, the concern that I had that they were cutting back the counselling for women who had been sexually abused. That was an absolute disgrace. And they combined that with cutting back counselling for families of suicide victims. So what sort of a government is it that directs that sort of policy to the ACC when it has such negative and damaging effects on individuals? And then, of course, there was the move to lift the levies on motorbikes. Now, as you're aware, Mr Speaker, I'm a motorbike rider. I got my bill the other day. The ACC component for registration was about $531. And what annoys me, having never made a claim in 45 years of motorbike riding, Mr Speaker, was that I'm paying for the accidents caused by cars that don't see motorbikes, and by a government who keeps roads in a state where actually a lot of accidents are caused by the state of the roads. So I'm wondering whether, something that should have been in this bill was addressing those sort of problems with ACC. But of course we had a further debacle with ACC, and that was that the Minister resigned. The Minister resigned because he had written inappropriately on behalf of somebody who had been making a claim to ACC and not recognised and not disclosed a conflict of interest in that way. And that wasn't very good. And I think on this side of the House we applauded the fact that the Minister had resigned, but then we got a new Minister who started off with the whole of her executive of the ACC resigning over breaches of privacy, massive breaches of privacy, but the Minister taking no responsibility. And that wasn't good enough either. Mrs Collins doesn't seem to understand the doctrine of ministerial accountability, and we're still waiting to find out, actually, who did leak those documents relating to Bronwyn Puller, because we've never had a satisfactory explanation from the government. Now, I want to come to part 4 of the bill, Mr Speaker, which is about the Armed Forces Discipline Bill. Now, what worries me about this is that, given the reports we received recently at a select committee, at the rate of attrition in the armed forces, there won't be an armed force to discipline, so I'm wondering why we've got this bill before the House. Now, I say that with a real concern about what's happening for the government side to listen to. Is the National Party aware that there's been a drop in the regular force personnel in the last year of 1,000, more than 1,000 personnel? 1,000 of our regular soldiers, sailors and air personnel have disappeared from the armed forces, taking it down to about 8,500. Why is a very good question, as my colleague has asked. Because some of it seems to have been deliberate, people have been sacked, and some of it seems to be inadvertent. People are so demoralised they're leaving in droves. And what did we find in the Select Committee? We found that the attrition rate was 21% in the last year. 21%, and if you looked at the Navy, it was 23%. And what the Defence Force itself acknowledged, that this is absolutely unsustainable. At this rate, we won't have a Defence Force in a few years, so I'm not quite sure why we're amending the Armed Forces Discipline Act. But a particular concern for me, Mr Speaker, was what is happening to women in the Navy and the Air Force, because the attrition by women was that the numbers in the last 4 years have dropped by more than a third. Here we are in modern New Zealand saying there should be equity between the genders, and we want to see women participating. And what is the record of the national government? It's been a drop of a third of the number of women in the Navy and in the Air Force. And that's pretty serious. And, why are we losing these people? We're losing it because the morale, which the Navy regularly monitors, the Defence Force regularly monitors, the morale is the worst ever on record. Only a third, just over a third, of the people in the Defence Force actually want to be there. 2/3 are either ambivalent about being there or are negative about being there. And there's only one ministry, Mr Speaker, that does worse than that, and that's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where they've ripped the guts out of it, and most of them don't want to be there. So much for that bill. Then we come to Part 10 of the Statutes Amendment Bill, Mr Speaker, and that's the Electoral Act. Now, this relates largely to the lodging of list nominees and the payment of deposits. But I wonder whether the national government, in fact, has much more significant changes in mind that it's not revealing here. I know the National Party has been looking very closely at what the Republicans at the state level did in the United States. And what the Republicans did before the last election was try to devise every mechanism they could to stop people enrolling and stop people being able to vote. Now, that is the negation of democracy. But I hear whisper, Mr Speaker, that the National Party is intending to close off the date at which people can enrol before an election at the issuing of the writs, a month before the election. Now, that would disenfranchise tens of thousands of people. And I want to ask the Minister who introduced this bill, in putting a fairly innocuous provision in this bill, is that disguising what the government is intending to do further down the track in relation to the Electoral Act? We'd be utterly opposed to that. Then we come to the next part, Mr Speaker, which is Part 11, the Extradition Act. Well, that's the daddy of them all, because that relates to certain crimes with transnational aspects which are deemed to be included in extradition treaties. Well, that brings to mind one of the most colossal stuff-ups that this government has made this year, and that's in the Kim.com case. So, I want to know from the Minister, the police got it wrong, the Crown Law Office got it wrong, the Government Communications and Security Bureau under John Key's leadership got it wrong. What is going on in this area, and is this provision in the Extradition Act actually able to address that? Does it address the problem that we found from John Key and John Banks of amnesia, political amnesia? They couldn't remember what had happened. They couldn't tell us who was accountable, and Mr Key said he didn't even know what it was about. The truth was that National was over-eager to please the United States authority, and in so dramatically stuffing it up, they've actually undermined the American position, so they've really hosed off the Americans, and at the same time they've made the New Zealand public liable to enormous costs in the court action that might be taken by Kim.com against it. John Key said he knew nothing, the Sergeant Schultz defence, but that doesn't wash. I want to come to the next part of Part 13, the Gambling Act. Now, the Gambling Act, we know that there's another case of amnesia in relation to the Gambling Act, because Mr Banks went down to Sky City, he picked up a cheque for $15,000 in a plain brown envelope, but then he declared it as anonymous. And I want to know from the Minister, is there anything in this change that addresses that form of amnesia and dishonesty, where you pick up the cheque personally and then you declare it as anonymous? And I want to know whether there's anything in this part of the bill that also deals with the situation where Sky City can go to John Key and say, you give us the licence to print money, actually it's called more licences for pokie machines, and we'll build a convention centre for you. And I want to know how appropriate that is, and whether that is consistent with the changes that are being made here to the Gambling Act. I want to finally end up on something rather more positive. Well, I hoped it was more positive. It's Part 18. It deals with parental leave and employment protection. But I don't see anything here, Mr Speaker, that deals with the parental leave proposals in Sue Moroney's members' bill. I can't see any commitment by the government to allow mums in a very special time of
Sorry to
their life
interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired.
extra leave.
Very good.
I call Julianne Genter.
Thank you.